to stream it. You know, you should do whatever you feel comfortable. And I take the mask off for the conversation just because
Yeah,
some people have a hard
time
this is
hearing.
sometimes hard time hearing. It's tricky.
Okay,
But,
I'll feel it out.
Yeah, you should do as you feel comfortable. I mean,
Okay.
let me just pull something up here. You ready? Yeah?
Yes.
All right. David, I think we're ready to go. Thanks. Welcome, everyone, to Revolution 1213. Subjects are produced in relation to each other. Page 87 of Sarah Haley's utterly brilliant work of history and critical theory, No Mercy Here, Gender Punishment and the Making of Jim Crow Modernity. In this book, Sarah Haley takes us into the archives of early 20th century punishment of Black women in Georgia, into the archives and beyond as well. Perhaps the destruction of flowers. Sarah Haley is writing about one case involving two young teenage Black young women who had destroyed the flowers of the white neighbors who lived, the two African-American young women, girls, lived on Standard Oil Alley, and they destroyed the flowers of the white woman, Mrs. G.R. Baker, who lived on Society Avenue. That intersection is amazing. Perhaps, she writes, the destruction of flowers was the mischievous playfulness of children, as their lawyers contended. Perhaps the girls were indeed criminals. Perhaps the mischievous playfulness of Black girls under Jim Crow was a criminal positionality. Perhaps they were loud, raucous, and messy. Perhaps they were stealth, quiet, and deliberate. Perhaps they recognized the power imbued in the flowers. Perhaps, in addition to discussing friends and games and their heavy load, they complained about the unfairness of it all. Perhaps they thought, perhaps, as Fred Moten poetically suggests, fugitivity is imminent to the thing, but is manifest transversally. This remarkable work of critical history that not only rigorously mines the archives, but also allows us to imagine from its missing pieces, right? A meticulous archival work supplemented by what Sarah Haley refers to as speculative accountings, grounded in and elaborated from a range of archival documents, right? It's not an attempt to romanticize women's lives or relationships, she writes, not to remedy archival gaps, but enables a historical musing upon the emotions, ambivalences, and intimacies that might have marked their experiences in the context of overwhelming violence. What we have is a brilliant history of gender and sexual ideology and the reconstruction of the subject formation of Black women through the unique forms of punishment and degradation inflicted upon them. A real tour de force, Sarah. So today we read and discuss both Sarah Haley's work, No Mercy Here, and the brand new book of Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie, Abolition, Period, Feminism, Period, Now, Period. And it's just a great privilege to be joined by Sarah Haley to talk about abolition feminism. Sarah Haley is a professor of history here at Columbia, where she researches and teaches, so an extraordinary opportunity for our students. Researches and teaches the history of gender and women, carceral history, Black feminist history and theory, prison abolition, and feminist archival methods. The author of this amazing book that won many awards and we'll be reading this evening, from American Studies Association, Historical Association, Black Women Historians, just a slew of awards. And she's now working on a book titled The Carceral Interior, a Black Feminist Study of American Punishment, 1966 to 2016, which I cannot wait to read. And as soon as it comes out, we'll have another seminar here at 1313. Prior to arriving at Columbia, Sarah Haley was at UCLA, where she was the founding director of the Black Feminist Initiative at UCLA. And before that, she worked as an organizer with the Hospitality Workers Union Unite here. So before I turn it over, as I had suggested in the introduction, which is online, there are really three interlocking dimensions that come together, I think, to give abolition feminism today such momentum, both in terms of activism and movement work, but also in terms of critical theory. So both in theory and in praxis. Two of those dimensions are clearly articulated in the title, Abolition Feminism. The first, of course, is abolition of the prison, of the police, of the prison industrial complex, which highlights, of course, the state violence against Black men and women and African American and Latinx communities more broadly. This dimension, of course, is inextricably linked to anti-racism and anti-capitalism, and so it's tied to the larger arc of Black feminism, going back to the Combahee River Collective and the statement that we read earlier with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor here in 1313. The second dimension, of course, is feminism, and it spotlights the resistance to interpersonal, most often male violence against women in everyday life. And it's not always as present in the defund and the prison abolition discourse all the time. So it's somewhat unique to have an abolitionist, feminist approach that underscores the dual tasks of ensuring the welfare and safety of women at the same time as not reverting to the punitive mechanisms of the state. But there's a third important dimension, and that's really, in part, I think, Sarah, what your book and your work brings to abolition feminism, which is the longue durée historical dimension here. That provides the rich context and the history of ideological formation that grounds abolition feminism today. It's what you call kind of a history of ideology, which underscores the unique forms of state violence over time against Black women. And those three dimensions are what we will be talking about, how they work together, where are some of the tensions, and how they ultimately, I think, work together to create something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So the kind of remarkable way in which the critical theory brings these three dimensions and praxis together. So it's a privilege to have you with us today. And let me turn it over to you to start the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard, for that opening and also for the invitation to be here. It's really an honor. You've set up such an exciting set of conversations that take us into the depths of scholarly work and also ground us in the stakes. And so I'm really so pleased to be here. I'm also really grateful for Fonda Shen.
Yes.
Okay. She is just an incredible organizer and has set up everything so wonderfully. So thank you. And we are on the same wavelength because I'm going to start with that story.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll give you all a little bit more of the story that Bernard presented and then talk a little bit more broadly about what I think in terms of abolitionist feminist history. So in 1918, Carrie Williams, Hattie Bishop, Gladys Trumbick were charged in Albany, Georgia with malicious mischief for destroying the flower pots of Mrs. G.R. Baker and throwing a flower pot into the plate glass window of Mrs. Wooten's home. The 3 Black girls, whose age ranged from 11 to 16, were already working as laundresses and home nurses. And they had dared, in their time off, to saunter over to the white section of their neighborhood, making mischief on that Society Avenue. The judge called their actions willful, premeditated, without excuse, justification, or cause. He charged them with destroying other flower pots on other streets. He said their crime was a case of racial antipathy. To make matters worse, they had allegedly sauntered all over town. So instead of delivering laundry or nursing white children, that day they engaged in aesthetic political sabotage that upset the domestic tranquility of domiciles that represented the zenith of white femininity. For this most unforgivable act, they each received a sentence of 1 year on the Dougherty County chain gang, where they would be forced to break rocks and dig ditches for county road construction under gruesome conditions and always subject to the threat of rape by those who guarded them. Then is the paragraph that I won't read again with all of the perhapses, but we can talk about, right? No. But I end that paragraph by saying that perhaps the iniquity of property rights in whiteness was on their mind. Their wandering and breaking of glass was a traversal of what Saidiya Hartman has called the micro-penality of everyday life, toward the creation of a Black girl commons that obliterated existing relations of household and property. That is to say, the enclosures of white supremacy. As fall turned to winter, the girls found themselves in the chain gang stockade. They again refused their conscription to economic subordination and captivity in the service of Jim Crow. In the stockade, they dug and dug into the dirt to create a hole just big enough to loosen the stockade bars and wiggle their small bodies through. But they were caught just before the escape was perfected. Their fugitive planning represents, in many ways, the overlooked history of abolitionist feminism, forms of rebellion and refusal that resist the carceral state's technologies of gender enforcement, that target the realm of the home and social reproduction, that refuse the very premise of enclosure, the enclosures of racial capitalism, and especially the very legitimacy of the practice of imprisonment. I begin this story today to emphasize these points and to think through continuities in feminist theories and practices of abolition. In No Mercy here, I introduce the girl's story before arguing that the late 19th and early 20th century marked a genealogy of abolitionist feminist sabotage, which should be evaluated not in terms of its ultimate triumph against systemic violence and dispossession, but rather its salience for what it reveals about abolitionist practices of living, disruption, and imagining, for the development of epistemologies of justice and collectivity, contestations of the doctrines and binaries produced through Western jurisprudence, and the individualizing ethos of criminal punishment. Hattie and Gladys and Carrie left no abolitionist feminist political treatise. So I follow Saidiya Hartman and Marisa Fuentes in emphasizing that abolitionist feminist philosophies, like many Black feminist theories, must be apprehended and appraised through the rigorous straining against a violent archive, a strain that sometimes demands forms of creativity not sanctioned by traditional historiographic method. Whether we are attempting to learn about imprisoned people's ideas in the past or in the present, The violence of the carceral state itself, not just its history, requires particular confrontations, the development of scholarly contortions of strain and derangement, even if imperfect. After all, the prison relegates not just desire and relationships to its hold, but the ideas of those it captures. Certainly not completely, and usually not permanently, but meaningfully and dramatically tries to contain those ideas. So abolitionist feminism and abolitionist feminist history requires both the scouring of historical sources for everything they offer and the commission of a kind of historiographic heresy, which I consider part of abolitionist intellectual practice, that recognizes that the carceral state's effacement of Black life and thought cannot be resolved, but can be contested through otherwise methodologies. In all fields, the bars and employment prohibitions and parole rules and gang injunctions and forced migrations that the carceral state enshrines that keep us apart demand that scholars not just research, but fight. Fight in ways that demand creativity and ingenuity, and with a range of tools from research to activism. For me, this has meant attempting to engage in anti-carceral historicity and historiography, and to join abolitionist campaigns, especially with respect to the carceral logics and practices of the university. Returning to Hattie and Gladys and Carrie, it is their will to break and transform by making its gendered carceral logics visible, disfiguring the edifices of wealth as constituted by its most feminized domain, the home. Of course, they would not be the first or the last members of this sort of Black feminist abolitionist affinity collective. Abolition Feminism Now is a study of abolition's feminist core, imperative, and organizing ecosystem. The book is meant to be a critical genealogy rather than a manifesto, attempting to reveal the common constitutive threads of the work and promise of abolition feminism rather than to constrain it to a sectarian political position, they say. Using ecosystem as a framework through which to amplify legacies, analytics, and questions often obscured, and to mark a landscape comprised of intertwined networks, campaigns, mobilizations, and organizations. Abolition, as Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie note, draws profoundly on the 19th century for its inspiration. Just as racial slavery was the target of abolition then, a retributive and punishment-focused criminal legal system that has always been structurally inclined toward racist violence, they say, is the focus of abolition now. Davis has produced significant work on the concept of abolition democracy, powerfully extending the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and arguing essentially that today's carceral behemoth is an inheritance of the failure of Reconstruction to do more than eliminate slavery as a primary economic system. Specifically, the failure of Reconstruction policy to integrate the creation of life-sustaining institutions in the fabric of slavery's eradication, meaning that carcerality would become the primary mechanism for politically resolving crises of racial capitalism. Abolition Feminism Now analyzes the tenuousness of even the eradication of slavery's legal tethers, providing a discussion of the 13th Amendment's exception clause and the complex politics of analogy. And this is important because the politics of analogy, the analogy of the contemporary prison system and slavery, has become a source of debate within abolitionist theory and organizing for sure. But putting aside until perhaps the discussion later, that politics of analogy, a look at the gendered history of the Civil War provides force to Abolition Feminism Now's central claim that abolitionist traditions have relied on feminist analysis and organizing from their inception. Gender is often effaced as a framework for understanding the antecedent of slavery's abolition as well. So, to start with Du Bois, his 1935 masterpiece, Black Reconstruction, argued that the slave entered upon a general strike against slavery by the same methods that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave. He ran away to the first place of safety and offered his service to the federal army. This was a withdrawal of the slave's labor from the plantocracy, from the plantation system, and a bestowal of labor into the Union military. And this withdrawal and bestowal for Du Bois and later historians who followed him is what decided the war, transforming the Civil War into a war of freedom, for freedom. So in doing so, Du Bois cast the decisive agent of abolition as the Black male soldier, whose membership in the working class was clear despite his status as unwaged, and whose contribution to the Union Army was the story of abolitionist heroism. This war for freedom and the Union, as historian Thavolia Glimpf argues, was gendered in ways that neither Du Bois nor other historians have fully appreciated. Enslaved women fled, thereby withdrawing their labor from slaveholders. They disrupted the functioning of plantations, took up arms against slave owners, and nursed Union soldiers. They also used their knowledge of the plantation household to appropriate and redistribute its food and other goods to Union soldiers, giving them bread and meat and supplies, a gendered bestowal of economic resources that is not accounted for in the brilliant Black Reconstruction. All of these acts of rebellion are part and parcel, Glimpf reveals, of the general strike. But because fleeing women could not gain freedom through Union military service, their decisive abolitionist actions were acts of insurgency, not citizenship. Insurgency, read criminality. Abolitionist struggle has taken place over myriad Black terrains that exceed the 19th century battlefield and Congressional Hall. They extend to the sites of women's war for freedom, the field, the cabin, the street, the rural countryside, the contraband camp. According to my colleague Stephanie McCurry, enslaved women's struggle for emancipation, their political history, fits no state narrative, Union or Confederate. Thavolia Glimpf writes this political history, giving it a narrative when she says that enslaved women became outlaws and insurrectionists, highway robbers or pirates in order to achieve abolition. So understanding abolition genealogically, analogically, and historically then requires a gendered analysis that not only rethinks how the destruction of captivity takes place, finding alternative tactics and sites of contestation, but also facilitates a dramatic challenge to the very category of the criminal itself. Saidiya Hartman asks, where does the impossible domestic fit into the general strike? What is the text of her insurgency and the genre of her refusal? Such questions, I think, remain pressing, potentially transforming the meaning of abolition, its protagonists, an appreciation of the gendered genre of outlaw politics that emerged in the 1860s advances abolitionist goals of destabilizing the binaries of innocence and guilt, an understanding of incarceration as an intrinsic regime of gender violence. It is a gendering institution, namely one that upholds gender as a natural and normative order through both the organization of prisons and the criminalization of those who the state deems gender deviant, namely women of color, and especially Black women and trans women. Only a prison that does not forcibly separate family members or kinship networks, at all, even temporarily, even momentarily. Only a prison that does not forcibly separate family members or kinship networks force, and also does not compel family members to be incarcerated in order to stay together, as in prison nurseries. Only such a prison could be considered a prison not structured by gender violence, and obviously such a prison cannot exist, right? The grisly and pervasive forms of gender violence in prisons and jails, the invasive strip searches, the surveillance of women's naked bodies, the harassment and rape are all urgent problems to be combated that exemplify and advance rather than define prison's gender subordination. In other words, if no one in prison was ever raped, itself an unthinkable proposition based upon all world historical precedent, prisons would still inherently be a structure of gender violence. Abolitionist feminism highlights the prison as a system in which people are held hostage to forced socially reproductive labor. The cooking and cleaning and washing that imprisoned people are forced to do is extractive and violent, not merely because it is barely paid, but because people are made under threat of physical force or additional time in captivity to reproduce the conditions of their own captivity. Abolitionist feminism, because of its precise suturing of knowledge about captivity and feminist theories of capitalism, the body, and labor, helps us see that this forced labor for the reproduction of one's own captivity marks an inherent connection with past modes of racial and gendered subjection, and marks the essential problems of the prison system rather than only the particularities of pay or private labor in institutions inside prisons. One has to wonder what it would have been like to pose to an enslaved cook, to ask an enslaved cook turned insurgent rebel nurse whether we should maintain some plantation households in which she would have to cook in the service of her own captivity because the master was kind or the conditions were better. What would it have been like to ask that question? Ruth Wilson Gilmore now famously declared, "Where life is precious, life is precious." She's referring to Spain's relatively short average prison sentence for murder, highlighting it as a place where, quote, people have decided that life has enough value, that they are not going to behave in a punitive and violent and life-annihilating way toward people who hurt people, end quote. So I don't know whether Gilmore would connect this to her writing on social reproduction and organizing by Black mothers, but the focus on the conditions under which life is sustained is part of a deep and brilliant feminist analysis and tradition. It's not just the fact of life being or not being considered precious, but the practices that make life precious, whether those are legal and broadly political or constituted in everyday labor and action. In some ways, this is how I read her book, Golden Gulag, as an economic theory of life contained itself, rather than as an economic theory of the containment of life itself, rather than the labor extracted from that containment. That the containment of life itself is the resource for carceral capitalism. Abolitionist feminism reveals how humanism, what James Kilgore has called carceral humanism, operate on gendered terrains. Kilgore describes carceral humanism as incarceration light, a system in which jailers are cast as caring social service providers, providing opportunities and improved conditions to those in jail and prisons. Arguably, carceral humanism's most arresting incarnation is gender responsiveness, what Rose Braz called kindler, gentler, more gender-responsive cages. Those prisons often feature improved conditions and boast access to family and children and healthcare resources that meet women's distinct needs. And while we should be arguing and fighting around the conditions of incarceration at every turn, this gender responsiveness essentializes gender in some troubling ways and woefully underestimates the harm of captivity itself, especially in the precise ways that kinship is constituted in the realm of the everyday, the spontaneous, the quiet, the intimate, the private, the my child is scared in the middle of the night and I'm there kind of way, or the I'm taking a walk by myself to clear my mind kind of way. Never palaces, always guarded, the gender-responsive prison is a particularly insidious and demeaning incarnation of carceral humanism because it imagines the most modest renovation of the most grotesque and gruesome conditions of the cell and positions that renovation as the space in which criminalized women should dwell, not as punishment, but a marker of their rights-bearing citizenship and humanity, a fitting station for their life. To me, this is the sordid logic of docility and servility entrenched in the US social and political landscape following emancipation. It is, in a way, a mode of carceral humanism that reinscribes the carceral feminist contention that prison is a solution to women's social problems. When visiting my abolitionist feminism seminar, writer and activist Romerilyn Ralston discussed her time in prison and views of the carceral state. One of the students asked her what kind of topics she thought they should work on. And she replied that they, students at Barnard and Columbia, should think very precisely about the things they need and want for their own lives. Their critique of the carceral state should emerge from the gulf between that want and need and the conditions of life for people who are inside or who have been. This theory of abolitionist feminism is another way of thinking about life's preciousness, that attending to the needs and conditions for those who are or were or are likely to be locked up must be accompanied by, or rather guided by, an ethic of plenty that renders the carceral barriers to living in that plenty obsolete. Catherine McKittrick, and I'm closing out soon. Catherine McKittrick has recently argued about the importance of sharing how we came to know what we know, which is the work of genealogy. And because I don't have time to elaborate upon all of the ways I have come to know about abolitionist feminism, by way of conclusion, I'll gesture to or cite a few paradigms that I think are crucial to its formation, in addition to the ones that I've discussed. So it's something of a litany by way of closure. For example, the promiscuous sociality and open rebellion of Esther Brown and the perils of liberal reform as elucidated by Saidiya Hartman. The role of the domestic sphere in abolitionist feminism and the centrality of institutions of social living from Angela Davis. The historical contingency of carceral and anti-carceral feminism from Emily Thuma and Beth Ritchie. In other words, the way that gender and punishment didn't have to be this way, and the fact that it will not always be. The importance of feminist organizing where you are, from Stephanie Greenlee, Adom Getachew, and Ananya Roy. The organizing ethics of care, intimacy, and mutuality, and public thought from Mariam Kaba, Colby Lentz, and Elisa Bieria. The refusal of the violence of racialized gendering from Cece McDonald and C. Riley Snorton. The contemptible politics of family regulation from Dorothy Roberts. The role of feminist historical practice in contesting captivity from Thavolia Glimpf and Nicole Ivey and Marisa Fuentes and Jennifer Morgan. The politics of abolitionist labor from Tara Hunter and Robin Kelly. The cultural possibilities of abolitionist feminist practice from Shauna Redman and Lene Denise. The potentials of queer Black feminist political economies from Kathy Cohen and Barbara Ransby. The refusals of policing, gender and otherwise, from Robin Maynard and Rachel Herzing. The centrality of feminist defense from Kelly Carter Jackson and Corinne Gaines and Marissa Alexander and Desi Woods and Yvonne Wanrow. And the linkages between that defense and Black feminist radical traditions from Dale Gore. The texture of women's living under capture from Romerilyn Ralston. the feminist scholar activism of Erica Miners and Priya Kandaswamy, the gendered economies of capture from Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Grace Hong, the Black feminist trajectories of carceral refusal from Maddie Mae Thomas and Bessie Smith, and Roxy Collier and Erica Edwards, that the category of the terrorists is gendered and racialized from Assata Shakur and Joy James, and also that love is contraband in hell. And the many, many others submerged in our understanding of the political imperatives and rich philosophies and contours of abolitionist feminism. And finally, the pleasure in the riot from Zoe Samudzi and Hattie Bishop and Gladys Trumbick and Carrie Williams. It's my attempt to track my own abolitionist feminist ecosystem, and hopefully a gesture to how I know that all we have to lose are our chains.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much for bringing us into your book and beyond. I have some thoughts and reactions and questions, but I also want to make sure that, there's going to be a lot of room for discussion. So feel free to, start raising your hand and interrupting me and intervening and et cetera and participating. And I also want to welcome Romarilyn Ralston, who you were mentioning earlier, who's with us today, as well as many others in the room. Okay, so maybe there were three things that your brilliant presentation made me think about that I wanted to kind of pursue with you. So the first has to do with, in part, the difference between a genealogy and a history, and what that might be, and how important that is for praxis or not, whether we use one term or the other. So to start with, one of the most powerful pieces of abolition feminism now, I felt, was at the end in the section on now, I think it was on the section on now, yes, where they write about all of the failures, right? Our failures, the list of our failures is long. In a way, this notion of failure is this conventional idea that they didn't have tangible results from an intervention or from an organization or from, or that organizations fail. I mean, these are, small movements, they collapse, they come back to life, they're internal dissension, they don't, not as many people come out as you wanted, et cetera. And so they talk a lot about this failure. And of course, it's really important. It's really important to acknowledge that it's not failure. There's a history here, a history of action. And of course, now, one small question I have, of course, is, well, what about, how does that relate to what we all refer to as the perils of liberal reform, right? In other words, there are failures there too. This is a side question, actually, not the main question, but liberal reform also fails in the same way in which abolitionist efforts and feminist abolition efforts can fail as well. Why in one case is there more peril? At least I sense more peril than in the other. I'm sorry, that's a side question. The real issue here is, if this is a tracking of failures or perceived failures, which aren't failures but perceived as failures, is that a history? Is that a genealogy? And what would be the difference there? So that's the first kind of thing I wanted to talk about. Should I might as well go with all three, and then you want to? Should we do that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The second has to do with, if it is a genealogy. So the way I understand genealogy is this idea that actually we are unearthing some origin stories as opposed to others, right? Or that, in a way, there are always origin stories. We're spotlighting, finding another, right? In other words, in reality, genealogy is always operating. It's just that we're now doing the work to find another origin story. Okay, so this origin story, which is abolition feminism, displaces others, one of which would be something related to, say, perhaps Black Panther history, some of which we've studied here, Revolution 1313, George Jackson history of resistance and abolition to the prison, right, forms. And the difference in this origin story seems to be very much oriented towards anti-violence, it seems to me. That there's an element of anti-violence that is laced through this origin story that is very different than some of the other stories of abolition.
Okay.
And, you know, what was interesting was one of the pictures, because so they have lots of pictures in their book of posters and buttons and other things, is on page 93. It's Triple Jeopardy.
Yes.
I don't know if y'all can see it, but this is the picture. So it's Triple Jeopardy, racism, imperialism, sexism, a drawing. It's the Third World Women's Alliance, September, October, Volume 1, 1971. And 3 women imaged there, one of them carrying an enormous rifle, right? And so I was thinking, so how does that work? Because actually, so there might not have been a total consensus, but it does feel as if the thrust of what turns out to be the genealogy here is towards forms of anti-violence or non-violence, forms of non-violence that might not come out if you take other origin stories towards abolition today. And then so how should we think about that? And then the third question, I think, goes back to Marxism. So the critique of W.E.B. Du Bois that you offer, which is a powerful critique, I mean, what he was doing there, that was a Marxist move and a reading. And last year when we studied abolition democracy, Amy Allen gave a brilliant Marxist reading of Black Reconstruction in America, kind of how you can read it through that lens. And it was the withdrawal of labor, right, and the general strike.
Absolutely.
Does your critique, which I hear powerfully, it doesn't get rid of the Marxism then. It's a critique of the gendered ignorance of the way in which the general strike was portrayed, but it leaves kind of Marx at the heart of Black Reconstruction in America, possibly. And so questions of how that ties to racial capitalism. So maybe those are 3 topics that we could start with.
Those are all such great topics. I'm excited to dig into them. I guess I'll start with the first one, which is, I guess, I see the question being around how genealogy is distinct from kind of intellectual history, right? And also about, I think the second question was about origin stories, so I'll hold that one for a second.
And let me just add, as you were emphasizing, they say this is a critical genealogy and not a manifesto.
Right. Well, yes. So what they say about critical genealogy is that that is a study of political linkages. And so it's really, I think, very much connected to your question about failure. Because I think the stakes of seeing something like abolition as a contemporary conversation as spontaneous or more recent than, say, 2001 or 1998 or 1860, right? Like, depending on the stakes of, but in particular, I think not seeing the precise genealogy that they track, I think are high for two reasons. One is it posits something like critical resistance as a failure, which it is clearly not, right? Because it has changed the course of 20th and 21st century history by having a very patient, organizing, meticulous, kind of organizing, ideological organizing almost, project for decades that allowed the kind of abolition to emerge as a more dominant discourse, policy consideration in more recent history, right? It laid the foundation. And so I think that the stakes for that, for every single one of these authors is an organizer, right? And particularly organizers with critical resistance and insight. And so what they've offered us is a way of seeing how change happens through genealogy, so that something like abolition doesn't seem spontaneous and something like critical resistance isn't a failure. In fact, it's quite successful. And, I'm just reminded, I think, of Jack Halberstam's book, The Queer Art of Failure, right? And thinking about how success and failure is often understood in gendered and sexual terms, right? And so all of the kind of labor, I guess the labor that Rose Braz and Rachel Herzing and all these folks have done for several decades now, right? Needs to be seen as part of this very, very significant political genealogy of our time, political contestation over mass containment and caging. And so I think the genealogy is a way to contest a kind of discourse of failure, to show what it takes to have traction, but also as in organizers, these are organizers, right? Like organizing book. The question of failure, I think, has to be prominent, right? Because we still have prisons. And so why do any of this, right? And so I think there has to be a political analysis of failure in order for this book to be successful. And I think that this is a compelling one. In my class on abolitionist feminism, is a brilliant class. One of the brilliant members, Eve Glazer, is here. And they were very insightful about abolition. They had all this knowledge about abolition. But there were moments of pessimism, right? And in a way, it was striking to me how they could not see their own place in history, which of course is all of us. None of us can see our own place in history. But it occurs to me, right, that there is a seminar on abolition, right? A kind of prominent seminar. There is a class on abolitionist feminism. The kind of currency that it has, I think, is on base a good thing, despite, of course, its co-optation and incorporation and all of the very dangerous things that come with the salience of abolition in this moment. So I guess that's to say, I think both the genealogy, the genealogical approach, and a discussion of failure and what counts as failure at success is necessary because of the conditions under which the book is produced, but also, where we're at in this moment of the carceral state. Does that make any sense at all, Bernard?
Yeah.
Okay. But I also think it's linked to the second question. So I won't, we can have a more discussion, people can weigh in, but I think the second question is really important because I think the issue of anti-violence is central to abolitionist feminism, positioning the carceral state and prisons as a regime of violence, demonstrating how it differentially produces violence, in women and queer and trans people's lives. And also thinking about the criminalization of self-defense, right? So it's anti-violence, certainly in that way, but I think it's also, particularly when you think about this book, right? This book that is not supposed to center Angela Davis, but Angela Davis is one of the authors, right? And, you know, I think her history with respect to violence is pretty complicated, right? So just using her as an example, and by no means the only one, Ruth Wilson Gilmore speaks so powerfully on this topic of, you have to, let me say this, their theorization, their foundational theorization of abolition is a refusal to concede the demonization of violence in society, refusal to see the violence in society as a justification for disposability, right? That is what abolition does. And so it has a particular relationship to violence, and it's one that I think most abolitionist feminists would say that abolitionist feminism is what seeks to eliminate violence, right? Carceral feminism responds to violence. It says, if you commit violence, this should happen, right? Abolitionist feminism is an approach to try to radically reduce violence in society. Part of that radical reduction is a delinking of violent action with disposability, right? The production of people as monsters. So I think it has a really interesting and complex relationship to violence. And so much of that, because so much of the justification for incarceration is to do away with people who commit gender violence, the grappling with violence, and not just in a kind of feminized way of saying we have anti-violent or non-violent modes of organizing, but really in a way that takes violence seriously in its political formation, I think is a contribution of abolitionist feminism. So I agree that there's not the same symbolism with revolutionary violence, right? Though, of course, Angela Davis's history is very much intertwined with George Jackson's. And it really depends on who you look at. But so I agree, other than like Joanne Little with the ice pick in the 1970s, which is a very powerful image, it's true. But I do think there's a more kind of subtle and structural connection to the question of violence that is maybe less symbolic, right? It's less cultural or representational, but quite significant, I think. Yeah. But do you want to talk about Du Bois and Marxism, or should we?
Yeah. Do you want to do
Yeah.
Du Bois and Marxism, and then we'll take a second round?
Yes,
And also
definitely.
let anyone else.
Yeah, any questions, comments, criticisms, anything would be great. So absolutely, right, the general strike is a Marxist analysis of history, and such a compelling one. And just to be clear, what I presented was the Voldia Glimpse critique, not my own original critique. So read her article on Black Reconstruction, the gender of Black Reconstruction, but and her book, The Women's Fight. So I don't think that analysis, say, of the gendered contours, right, of the general strike diminish the labor analysis for a few reasons. So the idea is also that women participated in the general strike, leaving, right, which is a withholding of labor. And I think what a Marxist feminist analysis would emphasize is that the bestowal of that labor is gendered in the realm of social reproduction, right? So it is considered nursing, right? Or examples are nursing. reappropriating the means of social reproduction, the food from the plantation, giving it to Union soldiers. So while that's not striking in the same way, it is about a kind of theft of the resources of production of the Confederacy. So it's within a terrain, of course, of Marxist critique. But I think, there's a question of whether like the idea is inclusion of enslaved women into like the proletariat figure that Du Bois is constructing in Black Reconstruction, or whether it's maybe more complicated than that, right? I think that I would read this critique, and I guess we would have to ask the Volle Glimpf, but in my way of thinking about this critique and its meaning for now, it's both. I think that enslaved women were both strikers and outlaws. They were like strikers and pirates. And I think that's why, as a kind of historical example, they are so important, and why I just like think about her work so much in relationship to this current moment.
Great. So let me just, so I have one hand up here. We've got a mic here. While we get the mic, let me ask a question, and then you want to get the mic over there. So one thing that this raises in my mind is the relationship between abolition democracy then and abolition feminism, right? In part because Angela Davis at least uses the term extensively in the interviews with Mendieta that are published under the name Abolition Democracy.
Yeah.
And so if the critique doesn't undermine the notion of abolition democracy as a both negative and a positive construction of society, which the positive side of society could be built within the framework of abolition feminism,
Right.
then it's possible that those terms can work together.
Yes.
Or that they don't necessarily, like, so the critique doesn't eliminate abolition democracy, but it
Right.
makes possible a conversation between the two or something like that.
I think so. And what I meant to emphasize is, the ways in which abolition generally and abolitionist feminism thinks about investment. All throughout this book, all throughout abolitionist discourse, it's not just about tearing down. It's about what needs to be built. Abolition is simultaneously a process of building and tearing down. And so when Angela Davis, by way of Du Bois, so brilliantly, both of them, right? So it's not a fundamental, it's not a totalizing critique of Du Bois. But when she is building upon him and saying, right, the problem is that part of the infrastructure of abolition was not the building of institutions for social living. I think what abolitionist feminism does is it gives us a sense of the types of institutions that need to be built, right? So they're care institutions, not just, say, factory, like other sources of employment. There's gendering the question of what needs to be built in the positive sense. When she says abolition was not, implemented, she says it more beautifully, of course, but implemented in the positive sense, right? We have to gender that question of what that means. It's the resources for survival that she has written about in so many other pieces, right? In her work on wages for housework, in her work, Reflections on the Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves, she is always thinking about the economy of the household. And so I think that this helps us answer that question of the institution, which I think is very much linked to how abolition happened, right? How it was achieved in a negative sense helps us think about what needs to be implemented in the positive sense, right? So how and by whom.
Right, yeah. And this raises really interesting questions about political economy that I'm hoping we're going to come back to. But let's go ahead and please introduce yourself and ask or intervene.
Great. Hi, Dr. Haley. Thank you so much for your brilliant work and your talk. It's such an honor to be here listening to you speak. My name is Naja. It's great to meet you. One of the things I was thinking as you were speaking is how in No Mercy Here you talk about the anti-Black violence of the carceral state as ungendering, and ungendering for Black women in a particular way. And so I was really hoping that you could just talk more about how you understand the relationship between this anti-Black violence of ungendering and the gendered outlaw projects that you talk about in your kind of speculative telling of abolition as a project of pirates and sedition. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's such a good question. So I try to think about, I think one of the stakes of No Mercy Here is thinking about the carceral state as a mode of carceral gendering. And I don't see carceral gendering as the opposite of ungendering, right? It's a process of producing and unraveling gender through particular modes of violence and producing whiteness, right, as normative gender through really deep and persistent modes of violence. So if we think about that happening in the convict lease system, that is an extension of what it was happening in the plantation system, right? That deep, everyday, sustained modes of plantation carceral violence was both operating to ungender and produce normative gender. So then, if we think about that, we have to understand that those modes of rebellion also necessitated a confrontation with those particular forms of violence, and that the stakes of freedom, of course, were about upsetting those forms of violence. And it is why I think, that history is not, just kind of a flowery origin story, right? It's about how we understand the stakes of abolition. And unless we understand the stakes of abolition as unraveling gender because of gender's inherent violence, I think we're missing, right? A big opportunity, right? Organizing opportunity, a big opportunity for political change. But I think that it is embedded in the kinds of modes of historical fighting. And so when someone has to be both pirates and striker, in a way, right, that is a kind of gendered positioning, right? They know where the resources are because they were doing both household labor and labor in the fields, right? Which is a mode, as Angela Davis herself, right, has argued, of gender construction. The traditional symbolics of gender did not accrue to her, Davis says, right, in Reflections on the Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves. So you can see both the operation of ungendering and the stakes of gender's unraveling in, I think, those practices. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to jump in, feel free.
Feel free to jump in and raise your hand. What is it about this genealogical work that serves to organize or leads to praxis? Yeah. What is it about the telling of a different origin story that would, mobilize? How does it mobilize, and how does it shape praxis in a way?
Yeah. And I'm going to kick myself if I leave here and didn't mention Jasmine Young's work on Black women and revolutionary violence in the 70s. So go out and read that in response to the other question you had. So I wanted to remember that. But I think genealogy is not, the definition of genealogy is not collectivity, but collectivity is certainly ingrained in the concept of genealogy, right? we're doing this together because I know some part of what I know from someone else, right? So not to be too romantic about it or utopian about it, but I do think that there's something in a genealogical practice rather than a kind of charismatic, masculine, organizing, sort of symbolic approach to how change happens, which Erica Edwards has written about. I think there's something about that gets us to the kind of expanse of collectivity, the types of work that need to happen in order for change to be made. So again, just pointing to the kind of really difficult and long durée work that organizers in critical resistance have, and critical resistance not being the only organization, right? But that they have engaged in, seeing their ideas and that work as part of an inheritance for today, a political linkage to today, I think is important because it expands the horizon of what we understand to be necessary, both for ideas and for practice. I guess that's what I would say. I think about organizations that should be more well known in abolitionist history, like the Audre Lorde Project, which has been organizing against the carceral state for decades and decades and decades. And so, I think it's significant that, say, Deo Gore was an organizer with the Audre Lorde Project as she was writing Radicalism at the Crossroads, which is a critique of the carceral containment of Black women in the 30s and leading to the 70s, right? She talks about Rosalie Ingram and Angela Davis and makes those connections. I just think that, there's something about, this is making me think about, okay, it's not just a genealogical history. In other words, whose ideas shaped these ideas? How do we know what we know? But in so doing, I think it expands what we think we need to know about certain people, right? Why do we need to know that Gina Dent was involved in CR? I think that this is a bigger intervention, actually, to say that the thought projects, the influential ideas of someone like Beth Ritchie, right, who has just been so influential to every kind of incarnation of abolitionist feminism, right, that it's important that we understand her as a founder of Insight, co-founder of Insight. So the genealogy expands the kind of intellectual history.
Mm-hmm. And I take it at the same time, it also produces in a way, a kind of a chain of genealogy, right? Because as you were talking about looking at the work of Audre Lorde, for instance, right? Then we can look at Audre Lorde as part of the Combahee River Collective, which themselves take the name of the Combahee River Battle, which was Harriet Tubman's.
Yes.
She led that, and then in a way there's a way in which these genealogies kind of like build on each other to go into the past or to find sources of inspiration.
Absolutely. I mean, that's such a good example because Combahee was, I think, such an important anti-carceral feminist organization, right, group and theorist, as they systematically investigated and organized against the killing of Black women. There was a kind of a refusal there, right? And so seeing them as one part of this genealogy, I think, gets us to kind of the politics of refusal, the refusal to incorporate the carceral state, even as you are challenging interpersonal violence, right? That's pretty, I think, important in how we understand their broader ideas about revolutionary power, revolutionary action, intersectionality, and particularly in the moment, right, in which they are writing in the late 70s.
And so what it does is it gives us kind of like earlier examples, right, of interventions.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. And please
Oh, we have
introduce yourself.
Many questions over here.
Yes.
I'm Durva Mitra and a great fan of Professor Haley. And I had a question about abolitionist feminism and its relationship to reform, which is a question that you kind of addressed already. And there was an interview with Ruth Gilmore in this volume on revolutionary feminisms where she says, you know, that she's not an anarchist, that she likes water, that the state is the one that provides clean water, that we need the state and we have a relationship to the state, and that she differentiates abolitionist feminism from anarchism. So the first thing I was thinking about was, how do we understand the relationship of abolitionist feminist work from that concept, which is just anti-state? And then second, then, what is its relationship to reform? How do we understand and conceptualize prison or police reform through an abolitionist feminist lens?
Those are really big and important questions. And Durva Mitra is an extraordinary historian of gender ideology, so please check out her work. So, revolutionary feminism and anarchy. I have not, abolitionist feminism and anarchy. I've not read that interview with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, so I look forward to reading it. I would say that there are multiple trajectories within abolitionist feminism. I think there is an anarchist strand of abolitionist feminism, and I think that there is a deep communist state transformation strand, and I think actually that their simultaneous operation is what makes abolitionist feminism really exciting for me. I'm really not trying to hedge, but I think I really use both sort of ways of thinking about the future when I'm trying to think about what matters to, say, Black women's lives who are confronting state violence in the home. What is the terrain of need for working class Black and queer people who are whose lives are destroyed by the routine police intrusion, say, into their home? And also, what are their modes of rebellion, many of which, right, are in the genre of the riot? And so I don't know that I could speak generally for a kind of, I don't think I could say definitively what is the more kind of powerful formation in abolitionist feminism. I really think that they're both there. I think you look at people like Davis and Gilmore, who are just, two of the most important thinkers on this topic of our time, and you see, right, the abolition democracy is a theory of the state. In many ways, I don't think that Davis is talking about mutual aid, right? I think she's talking about institutions, state institutions. But I think that there are really exciting and beautiful theories by folks like Zoe Samudzi, folks like Saidiya Hartman, that are thinking also about like the question of want and need, right? And the racial and gendered politics of fulfilling that. And then when it comes to reform, I think that, I guess I'll just say that I think that one of the biggest contributions of abolitionist feminism is a refusal of liberal reform, which is not the same as a refusal of reform, because I think that abolitionist feminism has insisted that the gendered forms of violence and the gendered forms of deprivation that mark the prison need to be subjects of reform, right? An insistence on a focus on women, a focus on queer people and their experiences in prison. At the same time, a really, I think, brilliant way of refusing the modes of reform that entrench and expand, and I think, as Gilmore would say, aggrandize the system, right, of punishment.
Where's the mic? You got it?
So my name is Shauna, also a fan of Dr. Haley, and this is picking up on the genealogical thread, because it seems to me that in telling different stories, both about origins but also about outcomes, right? That there is this politics of relation that one can then build that differently articulates and situates people in thinking about how people come to know struggle and how they come to live through struggle, to live the life of struggle, right? And so I wanted to hear you, Dr. Haley, say some more about intimacy, because I think that that's what those kinds of genealogical productions also provide to us, is not just a kind of one-to-one relationship Angela Davis taught me about abolition, but about the kinds of care networks, the shared experiences, all of those mutual aid evidences that are not going to register at the scale of a drive or a fund or something else, right? That there is intimacy between those girls that broke the flower pots. There's intimacy amongst those women who set the fires in the prisons in Georgia. So I'm wondering if you can just say some more about how that functions as an abolitionist strategy, as a technique of transformative justice for these women, and what it then has to teach us presently about how to live an abolitionist life.
Yes. So I think that was more of a statement than a question. And so I don't know how much more I have to add to it, except to say that I agree with everything that you've said. And I think folks like Mariam Kaba, everything worth doing is worth doing together. Care is an antidote to violence. She and Saidiya Hartman, right, saying that repeatedly. Folks like Elisa Bieria, who has a lot of work on the intimacy of organizing when you think of what it takes to build a defense campaign, right? Around Marisa Alexander, around Risha Meadows, all of the incredible work. And so the only thing I agree with everything that you've said. I think genealogy is a way of seeing relation, and relation is a way of seeing all that it takes to build, all that it takes to organize, all that it takes to change. And so the only thing I'll add is that I do think that there's a gendered history, right, to intimate organizing, which is not to essentialize it as women's work or queer people's work, but that in many ways, right, there has been, particularly in Black history, a public-private divide in organizing. Who's on stage, who is cooking, right? And so thinking about genealogy in terms of intimate relation and struggle is just, I think, really helpful. And I think it's important to do the kind of really steady study of how change happens, how intimacy is ingrained in organizing, to understand change. Not to just give credit where credit is due, though that is important, right? But to really have a sense of what makes change.
Great. So we also have folks on the Zoom
Oh.
who are with us and who have some questions. One of them is from our dear and brilliant colleague, Derica Purnell, who, and I'm not sure, I've got the question from Derica is, I'd love to know what you think, Dr. Haley, about the relationship between tradition and genealogy,
Yeah.
if any at all. So maybe we can add a third term here.
Yes.
And questions of tradition. So I suppose behind that question is whether tradition can do the work of genealogy, perhaps. But anyway, what is the relationship?
Yes. So thanks for the question, and thank you, Derica Purnell, for your work. I'm very inspired by it. So I don't think I have an answer to it, though. I think about tradition a lot. I think about Cedric Robinson and Black radical tradition, and I think that on the one hand, abolitionist feminism must be considered part of the Black radical tradition, and I think I say that in No Mercy here. On the other hand, I'll never forget a talk that Hazel Carby gave actually at Columbia, in which she argued against the kind of extension of the Black radical tradition as framework and wanting to think about kind of Black feminists and feminist organizing as treason workers. And that has stayed with me since hearing that talk, and I'm not sure why, except to say that I think that there is something that treason does that can perhaps work with tradition. You know, I think there are moments of tradition operating, moments of treason, but it helps us think about what it means to be beholden to a certain construct, right, of organizing. I think that there are moments in which that is powerful. It is powerful to say, I am extending this. And I think that's part of what the work that genealogy does, right? Like, I come after this person, this thinker, this organizer, and I extend this. And so you have a foundation from which to think about what has worked in the past, what we believe, what we think. I also think there are ways in which the category of tradition has been constraining, right? And so I think the lift when we think about kind of Black feminist organizing, Black feminist thought, or abolitionist feminist thought is to try to account for the ways in which these modes have both operated within certain domains of, say, Black or anti-carceral organizing frameworks, and also have deeply challenged them to the kind of core. And so maybe I would argue for, you know, certainly that you can't understand, say, a Black radical tradition without understanding certain elements of abolitionist feminism, but that there is also a challenge to certain ways of understanding, say, how Black political organizing works. And again, you know, Erica Edwards' work is really important here, that I think, you know, a framework of treason, of deep criminality, right? Like a criminal orientation to thought and what has come before it and what should come after it, that I think is something that certainly Black feminism offers.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there seems to be more of a coherence to the notion of a tradition. It seems to have more of a kind of monolithic, coherent, continuous existence in a way, whereas one advantage of genealogy is that it's generational in its concept, and the generational aspect allows for kind of generational transformation in a way. Although, I mean, I think the third term here would be a critical history, which was originally, I would say, from Nietzsche, who is at the root of, in part, some of these notions of genealogy as a method, was an earlier way of thinking about genealogy. And so one other question would be, what about that third term? We have Sarah Bianchi on the Zoom, who's going to join us, and she's joining us from Frankfurt. Sarah, welcome. Hold on for a second. Okay, yes, we can hear you now. Great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great session. And I've got a follow-up question on the genealogical method. And I would be interested in further knowing the relationship between genealogy and ideology or ideological critique.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually wondering about that myself, particularly when you use the term "a history of ideology."
Yeah.
I think on around page 7 or something. Yeah, so that's good. Okay, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, in No Mercy here, interesting. Like, I feel like it's genealogical because I'm very committed to a kind of politics of citation that might border on inundation, right? Like, I just want to mark every minutia, and I forgot so many people, right? That's always, the author's worst nightmare, right? You forget a citation. And of course that happened, but I really feel very committed to, in No Mercy here, I wanted to inundate the reader with a kind of citational practice. And that comes in what historians call discursive footnotes. It comes in the text more than historian or probably anyone would like, Hortense Spillers, right, all the time. So I think one could think of that as genealogical work as part of a history of ideology, right? Tracking both intellectual and political linkages that allow a kind of critique of how ideology is operating. And so I guess, although I did not intend in any way for No Mercy here to be a genealogy, really, in the sense that it wasn't explicit in the text marking a track, right? That's not the explicit work that's happening. It's more submerged, it's more subtle in terms of intellectual thought. I guess the legacy of abolitionist feminism in No Mercy here is more ideological, is more genealogical. But I guess I think what it took for to try to execute a history of ideology that sees the carceral state and its actors as imparting ideology that produces a carceral gendering, right? I guess I would say that takes at least a kind of citational practice that is related to genealogical ways of thinking, right? Genealogical ways of producing history or ideas.
I take it that when you're using the notion of ideology here, you're not necessarily referring to Frankfurt School ideology critique, but to a notion of the importance of the construction of subjectivity through ideas and practices that could also be referred to as regimes of truth, right? I mean, this could be a history of regimes of truth, right? Or is that more specific when you use the term ideology?
No, I think it's general. Yeah, I think it is general. I think it's in the sense that you said, which is I was trying to understand how ideas about gender infused and shaped white supremacy, right? In Georgia, in this kind of longish historical moment. And so when I say the history of ideology, I guess I'm trying to track the history of continuity and change of ideas. So maybe it's a more historiographic way of thinking about ideology. Yeah, so
Okay.
it's not, yeah.
Great. Who else? Yes, Cassidy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Haley. It's so exciting to hear you speak about all of these. And I think my question maybe goes right after Professor Harkwitz's last question, which is I feel like you've talked a lot about how we know what we know, and this McKittrickian question of and also practice of a politics of citation, especially to the women and Black women thinkers, and that being really steeped in that tradition. And I think my question is how this other prong of genealogy, which is maybe the practice of our knowing. I think at one point you said there's a real attention, like a feminist attention to our living as looking towards as our knowing, and it reveals different things about subject formation, and it maybe reveals different things about where, like who we know from, but also how we're changing our knowing, maybe as a product of this genealogy. So I know that was kind of convoluted, but I guess my question is, what are the implications for this kind of extraordinary genealogy for how we challenge, binaries and challenge categorizations and kind of the hampering of this layered history or genealogy or critical history of oppressive categorizations, oppressive knowledges, and how does that follow from maybe that very citational history of how we know?
Yeah, I think there's like kind of a basic answer to that, which is citation or genealogy provides example of ways of living and critiques of carceral ways of living. But it's such a great question, and I actually am going to demur because there are two incredible books that I think take on that topic very explicitly, or will. Ruth Wilson Gilmore's new book, Rehearsals for Living, or Change Everything, in which I think she'll talk about rehearsals for living. She's talked about rehearsals for living or abolition as rehearsal for living. And so you might think of citation as part of that rehearsal being something that happens through repetition, but also being something that thinks about what has happened in the past as a way of going forward, what has been said in the past. And then Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard will soon have a book that's going to be a real incredible kind of example of, I think, new methods of writing that is also on the question of rehearsals for living, and thinking about practice and thinking, and it's a set of exchanges between them, I believe, during the COVID era. And both of whom are incredible abolitionists, feminists, organizers, and thinkers. So I guess genealogically, that's in part where the conversation is going. But I think that, maybe thinking about the relationship between citation and rehearsal is one way to get at like what practice might mean.
Thank you. Let's see.
I've got Sonia Anwar and then Basuli Deb. Sonia Anwar.
Hi, Professor Haley. I have two questions. One is about what you had talked about, the idea of pessimism in seminars on abolition. And you mentioned creating space for discussion on conditions of success and failures. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on that, on specifically those two, whether the failure itself is a form of success, a degree or measure of success, if that is the discussion that needs to be had, or whether even that question seems to arise in apparent relief as the idea of abolition restrained within this idea of practice. Mm-hmm. This sometimes I think a forced notion of abolition as a vector, this idea of a force plus direction towards something. So when we create that space of discussion for these conditions, how do we introduce, what is the lens that you would look at or deploy to look at these two ideas of success and failures? Mm-hmm. Is it a lens, is it a comparative lens, is it a historical lens, psychological lens? So perhaps if you could talk a little bit more about that idea of success and failure. And then the other question that I had builds a little bit on what has already been talked about, the notion of intimacy and the potentialities in intimacy. And it goes back to what you started with, the story of the Black girls. And I'm wondering if you could talk about Black female friendship versus the affinity collectives that you had mentioned. How, if there is a distinction there, and also whether specifically with Black female friendships, what is the dynamic there, if an inherent dynamic, or whether it exists in opposition to how those friendships are set up. So perhaps the notion of tradition versus treason, if that's the dynamic. So perhaps if you could speak a little bit more about that too, that'd be great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of pessimism and success and failure is so complicated in Black history and cultural theory, because I think that, you know, these organizing histories are so important, and there has been so much achieved by them, and yet we must grapple with the failure and failure and failure and failure and resilience, right, of the carceral state and, you know, racial capitalism. And so it is, I don't know that there's a framework to be deployed to reconcile those things, right? The significance of the organizing, the, you know, question of change and struggle, and yeah, to, you know, think about the ways in which, you know, so many like women of color who are like confined to the lowest rungs of the nursing profession were just sacrificed into like a pandemic slaughter. Like what, you know, and I think at the same time that, you know, nurses organizing and unionization is some of the most powerful organizing that has happened as of late. So it's just like, that is, I think, the dilemma of historical analysis. And I kind of just think I sit with both rather than trying to reconcile it in a seminar or otherwise. I don't know, I guess students might have a better perspective on that. Intimacy and friendship and collectivity, I think, is related to that first question, right? I do think friendship is an intimacy, and organizing intimacies are resources through which to continue in the face of failure and agony and violence. And I also think they exceed that, right? They're not produced solely for a confrontation, solely for resistance. I think that they are, there's something else that I'm not going to be able to encapsulate neatly right now, but that is about living otherwise. That is in excess of that, and that, so that, you know, rebel friendships, treasonous friendships, you know, kind of resists a kind of, particularly as they're incarnated in organizing, resist a kind of classification, you know. And I think that there are ways in which those forms of intimacy must be illuminated by historians, by scholars, by organizers, but also, I think, have their own opaqueness that is also important. You know, the kinds of modes of secrecy. I don't know everything that Hattie and Gladys and Carrie said to each other, nor do I think they think I should know. But I think their story is important. And I think there might be something we lose about the kind of rebellious, riotous anarchy that they had in the not knowing and the archival silences. But I also think there's something that is important about that, right? Something that is almost sacred. And so, as a historian, I grapple with that all of the time. It is the question of opaqueness and openness, and where do you begin and end in trying to narrate a story that is not your own, and it's never going to be your own. But that I think we lose something deeply if we relegate those stories that are already submerged in the archive to a place of unknowability. So I think it's wrestling with what might remain unknown and unknowability.
Thank you. Vasily?
So I'm interested in more in the question of praxis, and this is a hypothetical situation.
Okay.
If you were to sit with a particular group of carceral feminists, yes, particularly the targets of Larry Nassar, the Michigan State University doctor.
The young women,
yes,
who were targeted.
Yes.
Okay.
Because they were all testifying and they were following a carceral logic, right? How would you explain your point of view so this generation would be able to see it despite the fact that you're talking to targets, because that's the real issue, right? It's often the targets who,
Well, I think, I don't think that we know the extent to which survivors want carceral solutions. I think that there's tons of evidence and tons of organizing around anti-carceral or abolitionist feminism that is led by survivors. In fact, I think most abolitionist feminists have experienced, deep forms of gender violence. So I think that is as real as the scenario you're laying out. And there certainly is nothing that I could say to someone who has been violated in the span of a half hour to think that I'm going to persuade them. That would be a kind of hubris and, fiction that I certainly would not pretend to have. So I think that it relates to the last question, right? Any kinds of ways of thinking about what redress would be like, what compensation would be like, what being made whole or being made better would be like, would have to be sustained. That is why organizing and mutual aid is so important. But of course, I think that organizers who have far more experience than me in that work, but what I know of that work is that it's all about centering survivors, right? It's not about marginalizing or eliding survivors. It's about centering what it means to have some restoration, right? Some kind of affiliation. What was broken? And what, if anything, about that breaking can be repaired and how? I think it's about listening and asking questions. And I think what I have learned from folks who do transformative justice is that ultimately at the end of those sustained sets of questions and relationships building, right? Like the answer to what people really want when they have been violated is usually not someone else being in a cage, right? Because that doesn't restore. But I'm not going to say that's a certainty. I think we live in a world so deeply constructed by carcerality as the solution. Abolitionist feminists are not magicians, but I do think that is why a genealogy of organizing, why Mariam Kaba and other folks, Mimi Kim, Circe Mendez, right? All these folks who are doing this incredible transformative justice work, right? It is just as the violence that is the gender violence that we face is interpersonal and severe and also structural. I think the opposition to that is going to be interpersonal and sustained and structural, institutional, about, right, thinking about what it takes for any kind of redress, right? Any kind of assistance to the survivor. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question, I mean, I'm thinking of this through the lens of the death penalty, because that's
Yes.
where I come from.
Of course.
But the question is whether what you try to do is kind of ambiguate the response so as to show that not everyone wants a carceral response, so as to diffuse in a way the naturalness of
Right.
the carceral response, without necessarily ever taking the next step of thinking that that it would be possible to convince someone, right? So that the work is actually more limited in a way. It's just to show, and a lot of the work that's been done in the death penalty context has been families of, surviving families against the death
Yes.
penalty, right? And what those movements try to do is to just show there isn't a universal response. It's not right. Not everybody, right? And but then to leave it to some kind of an overall democratic process that not everyone will be satisfied with ultimately, right? And I don't know to what extent. I don't know how far abolition feminism would want to try and get to a place where everyone would be satisfied, or whether there would be kind of sufficient forms of progress or something, were we to have an abolitionist world, even though not everyone's on board, or something like that, right? I mean, those are
Yeah.
two different
Right.
extents to which one could imagine the praxis going, right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, because it's like, I'm not on board with this world, so I'm kind of on board with another world that not everyone is on board with, and I understand enough to know that, like, what I'm trying to do is not to create a utopia, but to change power, to confront, power and make change enough so that it is better for most people. And I ultimately, though, think that because it will be better for most people, certainly most people will be more satisfied than now, which, again, because I don't think of abolition as utopian, but I do think of it as ambitious, right?
Deeply.
And so I think that I don't think there's a world in which everyone is completely satisfied with, and, there are going to be, I am not speaking for these, but there are going to be losers in an abolitionist world, right? Because there are people who are very racist and very wealthy, and you know what I'm saying? And so universal satisfaction is definitely not, at least my way of thinking about it, but I do think that there will be broad satisfaction. Yeah. What do you think?
What do I think?
Yes.
Well, I think it raises very complicated questions about violence that we were talking about earlier, because ultimately, I think that I think one has to have a copious understanding of what violence is. And when you were just mentioning that some people would not necessarily benefit from, say, or that there would be losers or something, right? I mean, I consider that a a violent form of transformation. I mean, it's inevitable that some people, say, in an abolitionist world, will be dispossessed of certain of their possessions, whether it's wealth or power or whatever, and that is actually a form of violence. But in some sense, it's inevitable in political struggle. So, but that raises a complicated question about nonviolence, which I think is fundamental to, or at least I read it as fundamental to abolition feminism, but it raises a complicated question about what does nonviolence mean. Do you want to jump in?
There's also a question over there.
Over where? Okay, great.
Sorry.
Thank you. I have to admit, this is more of like an intervention than a question. But there seems to be a pretty robust literature on like the realm of aesthetic, or like the aesthetic theory on violence and nonviolence. And I mean, Professor Karuna Mantena in the political science department is wonderful, focusing mostly on Gandhi, but and just like, I wonder how aesthetics, it seems to me that that might be an actually more apt for abolition, where like in the connection of form and content, in the sense that the iterative nature of abolition and the insistence upon like second, third, fourth, chances, the insistence on resilience after failures, theoretically both, it seems like that the aesthetic dimension might actually be more apt for abolition than violence and nonviolence, but also just that aesthetics is a helpful tool in resisting, if we just think about like determinate ends as violent rather than necessarily material violence, right? So the determinate ends of the carceral system as violent rather than necessarily like perhaps the people who are dispossessed of whatever they have in this revolution, that is an act of violence within a nonviolent world, perhaps, and just figuring out the dynamics there. But yeah, just that aesthetics might be a helpful way of thinking about it.
Or ethics as well. Right? Yeah, please do.
So on the issue of nonviolence, I want to, this is not a question, but this might help us to broaden, the conversation. I'm thinking about how Desmond Tutu, when he foregrounded Ubuntu, which is the South African, or rather Pan-African concept of forgiveness, during the Truth and Reconciliation, he was slammed by people who have suffered atrocities. And he was told that you're manipulating us through a Christian logic of forgiveness. Only people who have been targeted have the right to decide whether they will forgive or not, because it was re-traumatizing a whole bunch of people. Okay. So I just wanted to, because if we are talking about justice, and I understand we can't there's no universal satisfaction, but then when, I'm just thinking in terms of what the responsibilities are when we are working through a logic of justice. Because
yeah. But can I ask, who are you thinking about in terms of who would be the people violated in this sort of analogy?
Oh, so during the apartheid, the tremendous atrocities.
I understand the South African context.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think about how it's manifesting in this question.
So it depends on if we are going to look at the example I put on the table, right? Larry Nassar's
Yes.
targets,
I
right?
see. That is the analogy. Okay.
Yes. So then if we are asking them to forgive so that we can
Right.
counter a carceral logic,
Right.
what does that
Right.
do in
Got
terms
it.
of justice? Yeah.
I don't know that I'm asking anyone to forgive, at least not immediately.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't think that transformative justice practices require an instantaneous forgiveness. I don't know that they all require ultimate forgiveness. I think it's just about like accountability being survivor-centered rather than punitive-centered. So that's why I was asking if you're still referring to the previous analogy, because it helps me think about, because my mind initially went to, oh yeah, they're survivors of the carceral state, right? Like, are we gonna ask them to, in an abolitionist world, forgive, those most responsible for carceral expansion, right? I think it is, though, less about that. I understand, though, not because I do understand that it's a tricky distinction. Yes. Absolutely, right? And it's not about ignoring the affective and emotional needs and demands of survivors at all. And so I think that the emotional life of like transformative justice and abolition as part of that is really important. And I just think, I'm probably not the best person to expand upon it because there's just such a rich, amazing set of work on transformative justice itself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous, yeah. So the place, this raises the huge and important question of the place of transformative justice as part of the framework here.
Yeah.
And how that's achieved. And it also ties back to the other question that related to abolition democracy about what institutions or not institutions or practices, what needs to be built, which I think is integrally related to the question of transformative justice. How is that achieved? So what are the positive practices that augment not just the negation of the past, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good place to for a last thought, maybe.
Yeah. No, it's so important. And like I said, I am not a practitioner of transformative justice, and I do think a lot of that work really happens in practice. But I think, there is the question of what does the carceral state, not just, the fact that the carceral state does not prevent violence, right? It just responds to it. And so in trying to structurally, right, think about survivors and think about the future of gender violence, it's analysis of the carceral state as not the way to address gender violence. But I think within this realm of institutions and practices of transformation, I think the question is about accountability and also about, well, maybe three things: accountability, compensation, and restoration and care, and what achieves those things. And so I don't have the perfect institutional response to, the survivor for gender violence. But I think that in devising those, the paradigm that abolitionist feminism and transformative justice achieves is to center those things rather than punishment, which does not meaningfully achieve any of those things, really: accountability, compensation, or care and restoration. Although I do think there is an emotional aspect to seeing someone who has harmed you harmed, right? Or contained or sent away. So I think that that is like the only possible, and Stephen Dillon calls those carceral affects, right? I think that's like maybe the only thing that incarceration accomplishes for survivors, one of the few things. And is that enough to justify it as this institution when it doesn't achieve the other things, right? That I think are survivor oriented, but also meaningfully concerned with who we are as a society, right? And it gets back to that Gilmorean question of where life is precious, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And more information on the last 1313 is coming. Take care.